In this lesson, we're going to take a look at a number of movements in the 1970s and crises in the 1970s. First of all, let's take a look at the women's movement, which really gets started in the 1970s. On the top left, we can see a book, The Feminine Mystique, authored by Betty Friedan, which really got the women's movement started. Betty Friedan was going to start the National Organization of Women, a picture of which we see right in the middle there. And the goals of NOW and the women's movement in general was equality with men. These included things like equal pay, equal opportunity. This is at work. Balanced marriages so that there was an equal say in the marriage, and reproductive freedom. We see Betty Friedan in the bottom left picture in the front demonstrating for the Equal Rights Amendment. This amendment was not ratified by the 38 states that needed to ratify it. So it was not added to the Constitution, but it was under consideration to be added during the 1970s. When we talk about the issue of reproductive freedom in the last slide, we have to talk about the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court case. Probably the single most highly controversial issue in this country today is the issue of abortion. And the Roe versus Wade case, the decision, made abortion legal in this country nationwide through the second trimester of pregnancy, basically through about the 6th month. All right, and you can see by the pictures up at the top that this is very controversial, and even today, although polls today indicate that about 70% of Americans support abortion in certain instances. All right, it is still a highly controversial topic. We can't talk about the 1970s without talking about Cesar Chavez, who organized the farm workers, the migrant farm workers, who were very difficult to organize because of the fact they keep moving during the planting season and during the harvest season. So this is a group that is easily exploitable. And he organized them into a union called the United Farm Workers. All right, so he got their plight recognized, which was ultra low pay and very difficult and unpleasant working conditions, right, and was able to garner support outside of the community, nationwide, and as well as among the farm workers themselves, to create the union so that the farm workers could get better pay and better working conditions. One more movement to talk about, and that's the environmental movement. Like the women's movement, the environmental movement started with a book. If we look at the middle picture in the left-hand column, I should make it a little bit larger for you, we see the book Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson, who's pictured there. In the book, she warns about the pesticide DDT, and as a result of the outcry reading the book brought about regarding DDT, DDT was banned in this country. The concern is that, and the term Silent Spring refers to the fact that we can see from this picture the pesticide is running off, and so the fish absorb it, and the birds eat the fish, and as a result, the eggs don't hatch. There's some issue with the egg shells being too soft, so you don't have hatching birds. Hence, no chirping in the springtime, which is what the title Silent Spring refers to. We see here in 1970 we had the passage of the Clean Air Act, which attempted to clean up the pollution being spewed by our nation's factories. That's followed up in 1972 with the Clean Water Act, all right, so that polluters were forced to clean up the pollution that they were discharging from their factories into the rivers. I should say all waterways, not just the rivers. We're going to move from movements now to the crisis portion of the lesson. And our first crisis is the oil crisis of 1973. There was a war, you see here, the Arab-Israeli War, and the United States supported Israel. As a result, the Arab members of OPEC, we'll talk about them in a minute, stopped selling us oil, and this led to signs that you see here. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and on this world map here, they're pictured in yellow, and they control a significant percentage of the world's oil. And in attempting to limit production from each of the countries, each of the member countries, they can influence the price of gasoline at the pump. All right, now they don't control all of the world's oil production, but they control a significant percentage of it. We see here the Arab countries that stopped selling us the oil in 1973, which is Saudi Arabia in particular. All right, as a result of their embargo or refusing to sell us oil, that led to major spike in gasoline prices and shortages here in the United States. So if you ask someone that lived through 1973, they remember the lines by the gas stations snaking around the street, and this was an all too familiar sign for folks that remember the oil crisis of the 1970s. Here we get a sense of just how much oil the OPEC nations control, and you can see it's quite significant. Notice Russia has a fair amount of oil, as does other nations around the world, including the United States. So the question that we're asking today, as we begin taking natural gas out of North Dakota, and we talk about the Keystone Pipeline and whether or not to build it to move the oil that's being pulled out of the sands in Canada, shale oil, is do we want to keep purchasing oil from countries that don't like us? The Watergate crisis resulted essentially in a crisis of confidence where the American people no longer trusted those that we were electing to power. The story behind this is that President Nixon was running for re-election in 1972. Nixon was a Republican. You see here the picture of the Watergate Hotel, and in this building was the site of the Democratic National Committee headquarters. And it turns out Nixon wanted to find out the strategy that was going to be used against him in the 1972 election. So people burglarized the DNC headquarters, and the burglars were caught by the police, and what seemed like a routine burglary led these two reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, to continue investigating because something, I suppose, didn't smell right to them. And it is kind of strange that the DNC headquarters would be broken into, of all places. All right. It does turn out that after an investigation that goes into 1973, and I should point out Nixon won the election handily in 1972. It turned out Nixon knew it. Nixon was involved with the plan from the beginning. So here we see President Nixon in a political cartoon, and this involves the tapes. It turned out that Nixon was secretly audio taping everything that was happening in the Oval Office. Today, this is a matter of routine, and the president, it's all videotaped. But at the time, this was not routine, so the tapes were demanded. Nixon refused to turn the tapes over. The Supreme Court ruled that he had to. Executive privilege did not apply in this case. Anyway, the day before the House of Representatives was about to impeach President Nixon, who we see pictured here, he opted to resign, and he is the only president that has resigned the office. By the way, to impeach means to charge with a crime. The next event that we need to look at in the 1970s, I suppose, isn't really a crisis per se. It's the highlight of Jimmy Carter's presidency, and it was the peace agreement that was brokered between Anwar Sadat, the gentleman we see on the left, the head of Egypt, and Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel that we see on the right. All right, and President Carter negotiated a peace agreement. All right, Israel had no peace with its neighbors, but this agreement gave back the Sinai Peninsula that we see here to the Egyptians, all right, in exchange for peace with Egypt. And it was the singular achievement of the Carter presidency. The downfall of the Carter presidency is going to be the Iran hostage crisis. Student demonstrators stormed the American embassy in Tehran November 4th, 1979, and this involved the overthrow of the Shah of Iran and brought to Iran's leadership a religious clergy that continues to rule Iran to this day. All right, notice Mohammed Ahmadinejad is circled here. He was the former president of Iran now, but essentially he was the spokesman for these Muslim clerics. Don't get the impression in any way that he was elected. Not in free and fair elections anyway. All right, so we saw the hostages there, several of them. President Carter, who we see pictured here, did try one rescue attempt, but it was a complete disaster. All right, so the hostages were kept for 444 days. All right, and as Ronald Reagan becomes president, the hostages were freed, ending their ordeal. But again, the crisis really showed President Carter as extremely ineffective, and it did cost him the presidency. So then, just to sum up here, we saw that the feminine mystique really kicked off the women's movement, if you will, and Silent Spring led to the environmental movement. Cesar Chavez started the United Farm Workers Union, and then for the crisis portion of the lesson, we had the oil crisis when the OPEC nations refused to sell us oil. Then we had the Watergate crisis, where President Nixon's actions really had led Americans to be very distrustful of their elected officials, and that has continued through these years since the 70s, where Americans do not hold their elected officials in very high regard at all. And lastly, the Iran hostage crisis really cost President Carter the presidency. It occurred, I should point out, in 1979. We were going to have an election in 1980, and this crisis went on all through that election cycle. And of course, Ronald Reagan won the election in a landslide. And we'll talk about President Reagan in the next lesson.